To order. Welcome everyone to meeting number 9 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Health. The committee is meeting today to study the emergency situation facing Canadians in light of the second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic for the first hour and the Patented Medicine Price Review Board guideline for the second hour. I want to thank the witnesses for appearing today. For the first hour, we have from the House of Commons, Philippe Dufresne, Law Clerk and Parliamentary Counsel, and Michel Bédard, Deputy Law Clerk and Parliamentary Counsel. For the second hour, we will have from the Patented Medicine Price Review Board, we will again have Dr. Mitchell Levine, Chairperson, and Douglas Clark, Executive Director. I would like to start the meeting by providing you with some information following the motion that was adopted in the House on Wednesday, September 23rd, 2020. The committee is now sitting in a hybrid format, meaning that members can participate either in person or by video conference. All members, regardless of their method of participation, will be counted for the purpose of quorum. The committee's power to sit is, however, limited by the priority use of House resources, which is determined by the whips. All questions must be decided by recorded vote unless the committee disposes of them with unanimous consent or on division. And finally, the committee may deliberate in camera, providing that it takes into account the potential risks to confidentiality inherent to such deliberations with remote participants. The proceedings will be made available via the House of Commons website, and so you are aware the webcast will always show the person speaking rather than the entirety of the committee. To ensure an orderly meeting, I would like to outline a few rules to follow. For those participating virtually, members and witnesses may speak in the official language of their choice. Interpretation services are available for this meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either Floor, English, or French. Before speaking, click on the microphone icon to activate your own mic. When you are done speaking, please put your mic on mute to minimize any interference. A reminder that all comments by members and witnesses should be addressed through the chair. Should members need to request the floor outside of their designated time for questions, they should activate their mic and state that they have a point of order. If a member wishes to engage in debate, they should use the raise hand function. This will signal to the chair your interest to speak and create a speakers list. In order to do so, you should click on participants at the bottom of the screen. I should note that if for people who want to respond to points of order or raise their own points of order consequent to a given point of order, to not use the participants raise hand function, to just use a hand gesture or speak up with a point of order statement. Members wishing to raise a point of order, when speaking, please speak slowly and clearly. Unless there are exceptional circumstances, the use of headsets with a boom microphone is mandatory for everyone participating remotely. Should any technical challenges arise, please advise the chair. Please note that we may need to suspend a few minutes as we need to ensure all members are able to participate fully. For those participating in person, proceed as you usually would when the whole committee is meeting in person in a committee room. Keep in mind the directives from the Board of Internal Economy regarding masking and health protocols. And should you wish to get my attention, signal me with a hand gesture or at an appropriate time, call my name. Should you wish to raise a point of order, wait for an appropriate time and indicate to me clearly that you wish to raise a point of order. With regard to a speaking list, the committee and I will do the best we can to maintain a consolidated order of speaking for all members, whether they are participating virtually or in person. With that, I will invite the law clerk, Mr. Dufresne, if you would like to make a statement, please, 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, for your invitation to appear today to discuss the motion that was adopted by the House of Commons on October 26th, which provides that this committee, quote, undertake a study on the emergency situation facing Canadians in light of the second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic, end quote. As the Law Clerk and Parliamentary Counsel for the House of Commons, I'm pleased to be here today to address any questions that the committee may have with respect to the House's motion and the role it prescribes for my office. I hope that my answers...
Excusez-moi.
Unfortunately, he is speaking very, very fast and the translation is suffering. The translation is coming through, but he's speaking so fast that I can't really keep track of what he's saying. So I would just ask that he slows down a little.
Dear friend, please. And I will allow extra time for your statement if you need it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As the Law Clerk and Parliamentary Counsel for the House of Commons, I am pleased to be here today to address any questions that the committee may have with respect to the House's motion and the role it prescribes for my office. I hope that my answers will assist the committee. Comme vous le savez, la motion...
As you know, the House's motion includes an order for certain documents from the Government of Canada to be provided to my office no later than November 30th. This includes documents from the Office of the Prime Minister, the Privy Council Office, the Office of the Minister of Public Services and Procurement, the Office of the Minister of Health, Health Canada, and the Public Health Agency of Canada, along with all documents relating to the COVID-19 Vaccine Task Force and its subcommittees, as well as the Government of Canada's COVID-19 vaccine distribution and monitoring strategy, and the government's communications with the World Health Organization in respect of the Global Public Health Intelligence Network. The motion provides that the clerk of the Privy Council Office may request an extension of time up to 7 additional days by writing a letter to this committee.
Expressly excludes from its order the minutes of meetings of the Cabinet and its committees. It also requires that all documents provided in response to the order be vetted by my office for matters of personal privacy information and national security, and for the category of documents relating to the COVID-19 Vaccine Task Force and its subcommittees, that they also be vetted for information, the disclosure of which could reasonably be expected to interfere with contractual or other negotiations between the government and a third party. The motion provides that my office is to complete this work within 7 days of receipt of the documents from the government and provide them to the Speaker for tabling in the House of Commons at the next earliest opportunity. Upon tabling, the documents are to be permanently referred to this committee. I confirm that my office has not yet received documents in response to the order. L'ordre permet au gouvernement de...
The order allows the government to exclude any minutes of meetings of Cabinet and its committees for all the other categories of redactions, personal privacy, national security, and information that, if disclosed, could reasonably be expected to interfere with contractual or other negotiations between the government and a third party. The order is clear that it is up to my office to vet those redactions.
Does not preclude the government from proposing what it feels the redactions on those grounds should be, but my office needs to see the documents and make the final determination about what is provided to the House and this committee in accordance with the order. It is up to this committee and ultimately the House to determine whether it is satisfied with the documents provided in response to the order, the government's approach, and with any redactions made. This is consistent with the House's role as the grand inquest of the nation. Sur le plan du processus.
In terms of resources and capacity, my office has 15 counsel along with 2 paralegals and other employees, including jury linguists, the publications team, translators, administrative assistants, and an articling student, for a total of 35 employees. Our role is to provide comprehensive legal and legislative services to the Speaker, the Board of Internal Economy, the House and its committees, members of Parliament, and the House administration. We are also responsible for drafting private members' bills and motions to amend government bills, as well as for the printing of government and private members' bills as they progress through the legislative process. In some sense, we provide similar types of legal and legislative services to the House that the Department of Justice provides to the government. In response to the House's order, we have taken steps to acquire additional resources in anticipation of receiving more.
And begin our work as soon as we receive the documents. We have established a project team to prepare for the receipt of documents led by the Deputy Law Clerk and Parliamentary Counsel, Legal Services, Mr. Michel Bédard, who is with me today. The project team has carefully reviewed the text of the House's order and developed an internal process for uploading, organizing, reviewing, and redacting documents. As mentioned, we've taken steps to acquire additional resources in anticipation of receiving what we expect will be a very large volume of documents for review and redactions. This includes hiring 2 additional legal counsel to assist with this work as required. We've taken steps to mobilize and leverage our existing resources in anticipation of this work. The House's order states that we are to complete our work within 7 days of receipt of the documents. We understand this to mean calendar days. We are then to provide the redacted documents to the Speaker, who will table them, and they will then be referred to the committee. At this stage, while I do not know how many documents we will receive from the government in response to the House's order, I understand that it is expected to be a very large number of documents. Indeed, in his testimony before the Finance Committee on Tuesday this week, the Clerk of the Privy Council, Mr. Ian Shugart, suggested that it could be millions of pages. Given the unprecedented volume of documents, we are expecting this will represent a significant amount of work and full-time dedicated resources. Je suis prêt à effectuer.
I'm prepared to devote close to 100% of my office's resources to the review and redaction of documents in support of the House's order for the 7-day period. This will mean that all other activities in my office, including the provision of legal advice and drafting of private members' bills, will be severely curtailed or delayed except for essential services. Since the House is sitting, those essential services, the preparation of government bills, the publication of bills tabled in the House, the reprint of bills at the request of a committee, the printing of parchment copies, the drafting of amendments to legislation at all stages, and responses to requests for urgent legal services. So how many pages can we handle in 7 days? If all the workers handle 300 and 500 pages a day, we estimate that for the 7 days following receipt of the documents, we can handle up to 50,000 pages. And this estimate is based on the 6,000 pages that the government sent following the order by the Standing Committee.
Documents could be exponentially more than that, and the scope of redactions my office has to vet is also larger. Of course, these estimates may change depending on the volume and type of documents we receive in response to the House's order. The approach the government takes.
L'approche que choisira le gouvernement pourrait aussi avoir une incidence sur le temps nécessaire. Si le volume de documents excède celui que peut traiter mon bureau en 7 jours, j'en informerai immédiatement le comité et lui demanderai des instructions pour la suite. Je suis maintenant prêt à répondre à vos questions ainsi que mon...
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dufresne. I would like to advise the committee that we have received a letter from the Clerk of the Privy Council requesting the 7-day extension as provided for in the motion. And I would ask at this time if the committee is willing to make that letter public. I would ask for if there is unanimous consent to do that. So if there's anyone who wishes to speak or dissent from that decision, please identify. Please indicate. Seeing no dissent, I declare that on unanimous consent, we have determined that we can release that public or that letter to the public. Thank you all very much. We go now to our rounds of questions. For the 6-minute rounds, we start with Ms. Rempel-Garner. Please go ahead, 6 minutes.
Thank you. And to the law clerk, I just want to thank you and your team for all the work that you're doing. And I also want to thank your team for all the work that you do for all of us parliamentarians to, just on a day-to-day basis with private members' bills and legal advice. You're an integral part of Parliament, so thank you. I just have one quick question. Have you received any of these documents to date from the government?
No, we have not as of today.
So have you given any thought to perhaps prioritizing certain sections of the documents for review upon receipt?
Well, certainly our goal, once we receive documents, is to see whether we can do what we've received within the timelines. If we are not able to do so, then we would advise the committee and seek the committee's guidance in terms of what it wishes in terms of any prioritization in order to provide the documents. If we are dealing with the magnitude that we understand we will be dealing with, it will be physically impossible to review all of those documents in the timeline. So the question of priority would come up at that stage. But in my view, this priority is up to this committee and to determine.
Thank you. That was my thoughts exactly. So with that, Chair, I move that the chair be instructed to present the following report to the House forthwith, provided that dissenting or supplementary opinions pursuant to Standing Order 108-1B shall be filed with the clerk of the committee within 24 hours of adoption of this motion. The Standing Committee on Health has met pursuant to its order of reference on Monday, October 26, 2020, and recommends the following: that the law clerk and parliamentary counsel, when vetting documents under subparagraph AAII of the order adopted by the House on Monday, October 26, 2020, be instructed to prioritize the vetting in the following order: A, documents produced by the Public Health Agency of Canada in response to the paragraphs Y and Z of the order. Sorry, I just my staff have the door open and the sound on in the other room, and I can hear the echo, and I'm hoping that they hear this and close my door. So just moving on my motion in the following order: A, documents produced by the Public Health Agency of Canada in response to paragraph Y and Z of the order concerning vaccines. B, all other documents produced in response to paragraphs Y and Z of the order concerning vaccines. C, documents produced in response to paragraph W of the order concerning rapid testing. D, other categories of documents which may be specified from time to time the Standing Committee on Health. And E, all other documents that all documents be circulated to the committee in both official languages, and that the Standing Committee on Health may, on the request of the law clerk and parliamentary counsel, grant one or more extensions of the deadlines prescribed by subparagraph AAII of the order adopted by the House on Monday, October 26, 2020, for his vetting of documents, provided that he shall provide the committee with a weekly status report on the vetting process. So, Chair, and while the clerk is here, I think that we've heard a lot of interest, putting it mildly, in the Canadian media on the vaccine production process and distribution, et cetera. And the documents that are going to be relevant to the committee could be prioritized, as the clerk just said. So what this would do is, per the clerk's suggestion, give him some directions on what to prioritize first and foremost and produce first and foremost, and then also give him the ability to come back to our committee at future points. So what I'm thinking here is that we prioritize the topics that are first and foremost in the minds of Canadians, and I think have been in front of Parliament the most frequently over the last few months and are probably the most material to our response to COVID, so that we can look at those in an expeditious manner, and then allow the clerk to come back to committee and essentially tell us how it's going. So I think that this is an elegant solution to perhaps some challenges that have been outlined, and it would allow us to move forward as parliamentarians and be able to scrutinize the government's response, the adequacy of it, while providing some direction and clarity. I will note this: I do find it odd that the clerk has not received any documents yet for the PCO in a letter today, which is now public, and I can speak to this, to say that there are a substantive quantity and to quantify that volume and to not have passed anything to the clerk to date is odd. So I, again, would like to commend the clerk and his team for helping parliamentarians do their job. And it is my hope that the committee will support this motion so that we can give him some direction on what to prioritize and then what we can be scrutinizing in the first order. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Rempel-Garner. I'm not sure if we have the authority to give direction to the clerk on prioritization of document, or whether we can attempt to modify the order of the House. But on my first inclination is that this is in order. So I would ask if the members of the committee understand are aware fully of what the motion is here. I wonder if Ms. Rempel-Garner, if you could send a copy of that.
Monsieur le Président, excusez-moi, j'ai pas de traduction.
Mr. Chair,
Mr. Chair, I'm sorry, I do not have any interpretation at this point. I'm not sure what is happening, but I am not following what you...
I'm not following you in real time. There are lengthy pauses. I don't know if there's a sound issue with my connection.
I'm not sure if there's an issue with the sound or what the issue is. That being said, I would like to know what you are saying.
Did you hear did you get translation from Ms. Rempel-Garner's motion? Yes, so it's just me you can't hear. Okay, well, I apologize. So my initial interpretation is, or my initial concern is whether or not we have the power to give direction to the clerk, and whether we can modify the House motion in this way. And it occurs to me I would ask the law clerk himself if he could advise me on this matter.
Certainly, Mr. Chair, it seems to me that there is the House order that provides for timelines. And so, and I understand Ms. Rempel-Garner's suggestion was that the committee would report to the House. And so I wonder if the purpose is to have the House ultimately adopt that report as an order. But you quite rightly point out that the House order exists and it provides with certain requirements. And so if this committee wishes to suggest modifying that, it seems that would give rise to necessary change to the House's order.
Thank you, Mr. Dufresne. Okay, so that's my understanding now, is that this is will be a request to the House to change its order accordingly, to reflect the priorities that Ms. Rempel-Garner has proposed. Are we ready to debate this motion? Let's see here. I have Mr. Kellaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and colleagues and clerk. Good to see you here. Just very, very keen, as I know all of us are from all of our respective parties, to get to work here. And we have witnesses here today with important testimony, and I'm wondering, and I would really like actually to focus on the agenda before us. And for that reason, I move that the debate be adjourned. Now be adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Kellaway. So the question is, shall the debate be now adjourned on Ms. Rempel-Garner's motion? So I will ask Mr. Clerk if you would take a vote.
Mr. Fisher?
Yes.
Mr. Kellaway?
Yes.
Mr. Pawlowski?
For.
Mr. Zuberi?
For.
Mr. Van Bynen?
For.
Mr. Barlow?
Against.
Mr. Kimish?
Against.
Mr. McGuire?
Against.
Ms. Rempel-Garner?
No.
Monsieur Thériault?
Contre.
Mr. Davies?
No.
So, yeas pour 5, 5, nays contre 6, 6.
Thank you. So the debate will carry on. We go now to Ms. Rempel-Garner.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to agree that the and clarify that the intent of my motion is what the clerk clarified, that this would be reported to the House, and then the House would have to dispense with it. So just procedurally, I agree with the assessment in terms of how it would move forward.
Thank you. Mr. Davies, please.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I think it's an excellent motion. You know, from the beginning, I know that one of the main concerns on the government side, in fact, I think of all of us, has been how we can efficiently get important information to us, given that there could be a large volume. So I think this is it's an excellent way to prioritize, given the realities of the letter that I just saw this morning from the clerk of the Privy Council, Mr. Shugart, who essentially is saying that the government can't provide all the documents in time. And what I'm hearing from the law clerk is that given, you know, the Herculean efforts and extra resources of his office, he can't meet the requirements of the motion in the time period given. So I think as parliamentarians, the only responsible thing to do is to see how we can shape our motion to respond to that reality. And I think that I can speak for the New Democrats that I think focusing on vaccines, and I think the other part is rapid testing, are two issues that Canadians are probably most interested in hearing on. And I think this is nothing more than an attempt to shape the motion into a more reasonable path forward so that we can actually get started on getting the documents coming to the committee as I think the House wanted. I also, in light of Ms. Rumpel-Garner's last comment, I was a little unclear about the way forward too. I think she's right, and I think the chair is right, that this has to go back to the committee, or I'm sorry, to the House, but at the end of the clerk's speaking notes, after taking us through the practical difficulties of processing the information in time, he says, should the volume of the documents provided go beyond what my office can complete in 7 days, I will immediately inform and seek guidance from the committee with respect to the way forward. So if I could, I think it might help all committee members to ask, if I may put that question to the clerk and ask him to explain that, because perhaps I read that to mean that given that the motion has been passed to refer these documents to the committee, that perhaps it's this committee that can work with the law clerk on getting an efficient path forward so that we can get documents coming to the committee in orderly fashion, given the practical and pragmatic realities of the volume of documents. So can I ask the law clerk that? Can this committee work with you, or does this have to go back to the House?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Davies. And I think that my remarks really dealt with the practical way of raising a concern if the amount of documents is so significant that we know we are not able to meet that timeline. But ultimately, at the end of the day, in terms of path forward, it seems that a change to the House's order would be required. The committee would not have the authority to simply on its own approve something that would go against what the House has ordered. And so in terms of next steps to address a concern, the approach that's being put forward now would seem to address that by having the committee propose something, but to the House, so that ultimately the House can make the decision.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Davies, and thank you, Mr. Dufresne, for your counsel. We go now to Mr. Fisher, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And although I don't support this motion, I mean, we've got the law clerk in front of us for an hour as requested by the Conservatives, which we supported. We're happy to have you here today. It's now 2:32 here in Nova Scotia, so 1:32 there. We're not going to get all the questions in that we'd hope to get in. So this seems like just another one of those things thrown in the way, a monkey wrench in the middle of this. But, you know, I guess with the 45 seconds or so since I printed this motion and looked at it, we won't support this motion, but we won't speak to it as well, because I think it's important, and out of respect for the law clerk, we should get rolling on this so that we can ask these questions. And like I say, probably a couple of members now will lose their opportunity to speak to this. But I will say that we debated this all day in the House of Commons, and we passed it. And I think we should respect the motion that the House sent to us. But like I said, I think the important thing right now is getting to Mr. Dufresne.
Thank you, Mr. Fisher. Mr. Barlow, please.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Chair. I meant to lower my hand. Thanks.
No worries. Mr. Davies?
Well, just quickly, I guess, in response to my colleague, Mr. Fisher's comments. We do have the law clerk here, and after giving his statement, the nub of his testimony or his statement so far is that he does not have the resources necessary to actually implement the motion that was passed by the House. And so I think that this motion by Mr. Rempel-Garner is directly on point because we're dealing with the substance of the matter before us. The other thing that I must say that is it's troubling and is in the back of my mind here is that essentially what we're hearing from the government, from the clerk of the Privy Council, and now from the law clerk is that the law clerk, the government cannot respect the order of the House. That's what we're hearing. And so, Mr. Fisher referred to, respecting the motion of the House. Well, the motion of the House is clear, is we've asked for all these documents, so we've given a timeline, and the House passed it. So what we're really hearing is the government saying is they're not going to do it. Now, the question will be, can't they or won't they? I think it's a question of resources. I mean, certainly, the law clerk has clearly indicated that they've put on additional resources and hired additional staff to do it. But even with that, it's not sufficient. There is a reference to millions of documents. I have no idea where that comes from. I have no means of assessing whether that's accurate or not. I don't know if that's rhetorical spin or if that's based on data. But what I will say is just the other way to go is to say that the House of Commons passed a motion ordering the government to produce those documents, and it's up to the government to produce whatever resources are required in order to comply. I don't know that it lies in the mouth of the government just to say, we can't do it, and we're not going to do it.
Mr. Davies, can I get you to speak more specifically to Ms. Rempel-Garner's motion?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm speaking directly to the motion because the motion is predicated on the witness's statement that given the resources he has, he cannot provide all the documents that have been ordered by the House to come to this committee. Ms. Rempel-Garner's motion is an attempt to respond to that, I think, in a very responsible way by saying, well, let's prioritize these then. What I'm raising, so I'm supporting that motion because I think we should prioritize it. That's a rational and reasonable and sensible way to deal with the matter. But I'm also raising the underlying question, which is why isn't the government able to send all the documents, even if it is 1 million documents? That's a question of resources. It's a tough job to do, but it's not an impossible job to do. So I just raise that for my colleagues to consider in lieu of simply ordering the House to, expecting the government to comply with the order. And I suppose that we can take appropriate procedures after that if they don't. I think that this motion is a very, as I said, rational and reasonable. And by the way, where I'll conclude is by saying that, frankly, I listened to Liberals in the House oppose the motion in the House to produce documents. And one of their prime arguments was that this is too many documents and would be too difficult for the government to comply. So here we have a motion in front of us that seeks to say, okay, if that being the case, let's prioritize them and focus on vaccines and testing. And let's at least get those documents going, and we can give the government more time for the rest of the documents. Now I hear the Liberals say they don't agree with that. So that's pretty tough to understand. So anyway, I'll be supporting this motion, and I thank my colleague for bringing it forward.
Thank you, Mr. Davies. Seeing no further hands raised, we shall now proceed to the vote on this motion. Mr. Clerk, if you please conduct the vote.
Mr. Fisher?
No.
Mr. Kellaway,
No.
Mr. Pawlowski,
Against.
Mr. Zuberi,
Contre.
Mr. Van Bynen,
No.
Mr. Barlow,
In favor.
Mr. Kamish,
I vote for.
Mr. McGuire,
In favor?
Ms. Rampel Garner,
In favor?
Monsieur Thériault,
For.
Mr. Davies,
In favor.
Mr. Chair, we have yeas pour 6, nays contre 5, 5.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. The motion carries. We could carry on with Ms. Rumpel-Garner. I think you have a couple more minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Dufresne, after the House adopted this motion or right prior, there was a lot of concern put forward by the government particularly around section AAY of the motion, where it says that the documents will be additionally vetted for information, the disclosure of which could be reasonably expected to interfere with contractual or other negotiations between the Government of Canada and a third party by the Law Clerk and Parliamentary Counsel. I read your CV, it's very extensive, and anybody who has an understanding of the role of the Law Clerk, and I've interacted with your office many times in my career as a parliamentarian, there's a lot of expertise there. Are you confident about your team's ability to essentially get that part of the motion done in terms of what it demands around confidentiality, et cetera?
Absolutely, Ms. Rempel-Gardner. We have a full legal team with knowledge and experience on a range of legal topics. And as indicated in my opening statement, we are act in a sense as the Department of Justice for the House, providing those legal litigation drafting services for the House, obviously with smaller resources. And in terms of specific information that we may not have, in terms of factual information we may not have that the government would have, the government could raise those with us and could bring this to our attention, and we would expect that it would do so if it has concerns about the disclosure of information on this.
Perhaps I'll look. One of the things that the procurement minister said was that she inferred that the inability that if you had an inability to do the job, that Canada wouldn't get a vaccine. I won't make you comment on the minister's comment, but are you confident that you can keep the information that, let's say, Pfizer had concerns about confidential?
Well, it's we will be implementing what the House has ordered and the grounds that the House has provided in its motion, and it has provided as one of the grounds the protection of information, the disclosure of which could interfere with the government's ability to contract or negotiate with third parties. So from our standpoint, that's a broad ground that's meant to protect against prejudice to contract ability of government with third parties. And so the House has accepted that as a ground. We understand that ground. We understand the legal issues surrounding it and the implications, and we will apply those in our task.
Do you anticipate a delivery schedule for vaccines being something that you would redact?
We would have to see what is provided to us by the government, and we would have to see the context and, again, what concerns may be raised with that. Is the information you're describing, is it something that the disclosure of which could interfere with the government's ability to contract or negotiate with third parties? And so we would expect a concern to be raised. We would consider that very, very carefully.
And quickly, has the PCO, Health Canada, or any other government department reached out to you regarding the redaction processes surrounding vaccines, especially with respect to vaccine delivery schedules?
We were approached by senior government officials to exchange and discuss the practical implications of this motion and complying with the motion. And so exchanges have been had in terms of what to expect. And so So yes, there have been exchanges.
Is there any information that you can provide on that exchange to the committee?
Well, I would say that discussions centered around what the motion required and how best for the government to comply with it, how would the implications for my office. So it was really in the sense of a pragmatic consideration, looking as to how to meet this task that's set out by the House.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Garner. We go now to Mr. Van Bynen. Please go ahead. 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for joining the committee today and for their very informative statement. There's certainly a lot that has been mentioned, and it's insightful, and I'm sure that our committee will be asking you to elaborate on some of that. Firstly, in your statement, you mentioned redactions, and that it's clear that it's up to your office to vet them. And I'm hoping you could elaborate on your office's redaction process.
We've, as set out in my statement, we are setting out a team to review the documents, to look at if there are some proposed redactions from the government, really to go page by page, line by line, and making sure that the grounds that the House has identified in terms of the appropriate areas for redactions, that those are made, and that the information that needs to be kept confidential is kept confidential. So we would very much go about that in a very meticulous and very careful manner.
Okay, thank you. Are there standards for redactions enshrined in the Canadian law, and can you expand on the obligations to redact under the Privacy Act?
Well, in this context, the order and obligations to redact do not come from the Privacy Act, but they come from the House's constitutional authority to seek documents and to determine the manner in which and the public interest considerations that ought to be applied. And so we can look to those statutes if there are similar concepts that are found in those statutes. It can be a guide, but at the end of the day, the ultimate ground is the one that the House has adopted. And so this is what we would look to first and foremost, but certainly there are legislation, the Privacy Act, Emergencies Act, they're related concepts, and we would look to see how those are consistent and helpful to apply the House's criteria.
Thank you. And I understand that in addition to the Privacy Act, there are obligations within the Access to Information Act as well. And are these different than those that are outlined in the Privacy Act?
These are obligations that fall on the government and the executive in terms of what documents can be requested by Canadians, the grounds for redactions, the process for complaints. There are obligations on Parliament, the House itself, in terms of proactive disclosures, and there are rights for the protection of private information. But these statutes are distinct from the House's authority under the Constitution to seek and receive information from witnesses, testimony and documents, and to determine the grounds therefore. So those statutes are not limits to what the committee can request. Obviously, they provide for very important public interest principles that should be considered, but ultimately the committee and the House have the last word.
Can you give us more information about the obligations required under the Access to Information Act?
The obligations required on the government or on the House, because as counsel to the House and as counsel to the committee, I would say that the obligations the obligations do not apply to the House and to the committee. So these would be questions really for the government as to what it is required to do under those statutes, and the government would be best placed really to highlight its obligations in this respect.
Okay, if I could just come back to the redaction process. So imagine some boxes full of documents arrive at your office or electronically. What are the steps that you would be going through to determine what should or shouldn't be redacted? And are these items then referred to the government, or has the government highlighted areas that they feel should be redacted and you make the decision? So how is that going to work, just so that I can get a better understanding of that?
Well, one of the unknowns is we have not received the documents yet. So one of the things we do not know is whether the government will have proposed redactions or not. So if they have, then we would look to those, and we would expect to be able to see behind those redactions, to what is being proposed to be redacted, what's the information behind it, and then comparing that to the grounds so that the House has allowed. Is this something that is personal privacy information? Is this something related to national security? Is this information, the disclosure of which could reasonably be expected to interfere with contractual negotiations? So these are really the guiding principles, and we would look at that. If there are no proposed redactions, we would nonetheless look at the documents ourselves to see, is there information there that is problematic? But in terms of the national security and the interference with contracts involving the government of Canada, we would expect that the government would be raising concerns on those, and we would look at those.
Yep. Given the prioritization, I haven't seen the details on what was proposed or adopted just today. Would the focus on the vaccines, et cetera, be one of the areas where there might be a higher risk of interfering with contractual negotiations?
Well, in its motion, the House really linked the vaccine development and the contractual negotiation. So it said that this ground of information, the disclosure of which could reasonably be expected to interfere, would apply with respect to paragraph Y. And paragraph Y is the paragraph on the vaccine task force. So I think that the House accepted and understood that when you're dealing with this vaccine development issue, there is a risk that there be contractual information that needs to be kept confidential so that it doesn't harm that relationship between the government and the vaccine developers. So the House has agreed that this is a valid reason to keep information confidential. So if the prioritization results in those types of documents being looked at first, I would expect to see that ground come up. I would expect that this is where you would see this issue being raised as information that should be kept confidential.
So could that...
Thank you, Mr. Van Bylen.
Thank you.
We go now to Monsieur Thériault. C'est à vous. Allez-y, s'il vous plaît. 6 minutes.
Merci. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, Mr. Dufresne, first of all, I'd like to thank you for the clarity of your presentation and of your answers as well. I do not have many questions. I thought that the questions raised by Mr. Van were very interesting. However, I am not sure that you have actually answered to all the questions I have in my mind. First of all, I was a little bit flabbergasted when I saw the letter from the clerk from the Privy Council referring to 1 million pages. Well, it means that it will take, according to the calculation you have presented us today, at least 20 days of work, and very hard work and continuous work, to be able to produce the document to the House and the committee. And that does not take into account, as he says in his letter, that the document will be sent as they are. So we do not know the proportion of these documents, whether they are in French or English, what is the proportion of that, and we cannot either really estimate the time that would be necessary to translate those documents, since it is required that documents be transmitted in both official languages. So this is an unknown element that is quite important, and it's also connected to the motion that we're looking at. But in terms of processing or sequential processing of the documents. Well, nevertheless, I have a question, maybe you will enlighten me, concerning the decision of the clerk of the Privy Council to exclude that he will exclude the commercial confidential information. Well, I thought that he was going to send to you all the relevant documents, and then the motion that we have adopted would stipulate that be redacted information that we could reasonably expect that it's that it would be on the basis of contractual negotiation. So it is up to you, up to your own judgment and your analysis to make the decision, and not of the clerk of the private council. Now, what about the order of the House here? Isn't it really ordering the clerk to send to us everything? Answer. I believe that the way you read the motion indeed indicates what I have said in my remarks. That is, the motion provides for that the ground of confidentiality or the negative impact it could have on contractual negotiation is a valid ground, but it has to be approved in terms of redaction by my office or by myself. So the House has established, yes, it is a justified ground, but it is, at the end of the day, up to the House to be satisfied in terms of applying this ground. And from my point of view, as I was saying, I would expect that the government might actually raise this question and the ground that will be used, because, of course, they will have the information at their disposal, but the House has actually provided for the approval from my office or myself. So in order to do this, I need to see the information and I need to see what has been suggested in terms of redaction. Now, in the letter you mentioned that they said they're going to exclude this information. We have not received what it will mean. So will it be able to have this information or not? Will it be satisfied that what has been taken out was valid? But I have also mentioned that. Thank you very much. It really helps me in terms of this disclosure. And I totally trust you to really explain to us the various grounds and that this intent from the clerk of the private council to exclude some documents. So that really ends the questions I had.
Thank you. Merci, Monsieur Thériault. We go now to Mr. Davies. Mr. Davies, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the clerk for being here. Seems like we've really focused on this, but I want to be absolutely clear. Clerk, is it your view that the documents must come to your office in unredacted form?
My view, Mr. Davis, is that the House has allowed the exclusion of cabinet minutes. Minutes of meetings of the cabinet as committees be excluded from this order. So those would not be considered at all by my office, but the motion otherwise requests that the documents be vetted by my office for the other 3 grounds, which are the privacy, personal information, national security, and the interference, reasonably expected to interfere with contractual or other negotiations. And so the motion uses the word vetted. And from my standpoint, that would require that that my office be able to see what is the information behind the redaction and agree or not to make those redactions. And again, I suspect that there's much information that would come that we would give significant weight to, but the motion, as it's written, requests that this be vetted by my office.
Thank you. So if the documents do come to your office redacted on those 3 former criteria, in your view, would that be not in compliance with the motion as passed by the House?
Well, if they come to my office redacted, I would be in a situation of reporting that then to the committee because it makes it difficult, if not impossible, for my office to vet and to determine whether it's valid. Some of them may well look. It may seem to us that it is a valid redaction. Sometimes we're almost 100% certain, but others, we would not be able to. So I would not be in a position to report to you and to the House to say, we've done this vetting as you've asked, and here are the documents. I would have to indicate that I'm not able to do it. I'm able to do some vetting, but what's been already redacted, I would not be unless my office were shown the originals.
Well, I understand. I'll tell you the basis for my concern. One is I've just had a chance to read Mr. Schugert, the clerk of the Privy Council's letter that was sent this morning. But in that, it suggests to me that they are going to withhold documents on the criteria of confidential business information. So that strikes me as a foreshadowing that they intend on redacting information, I would say, in violation of the motion. But on that point, on the issue of his description of withholding information on the basis of confidential business information, is that, in your view, the same as the wording in the motion passed by the House, which is the redaction criterion of information which could reasonably be expected to interfere with contractual or other negotiations between the government and a third party? Is that the same as confidential business information?
Well, they're not the same words, obviously, and we would look at any proposed redaction in a given document. That said, the House's criterion talks about information, the disclosure of which could reasonably be expected to interfere with contractual or other negotiations between the Government of Canada and a third party. If the Government of Canada has committed contractually to respecting confidentiality with respect to certain information, for the government for that to then be made public, an argument could be made that could reasonably interfere with the contractual or other negotiation. So that's what we would look at to see, well, what's the information and why does it meet that test? And so but you're correct that confidential information is not the test. The test is, does the disclosure of that information, could that reasonably be expected to interfere with contractual or other negotiations?
Clerk, you've done this kind of job before. Is it possible for the government to send you documents in kind of waves of information? In other words, would it be possible for the government to send you documents that they have already, so that you could start to get to work underway in executing on the motion, as opposed to waiting?
Well, I don't want to indicate what's possible or not for the government to do. That would be for them to say. I can say that if certainly my office can start looking at documents as soon as we receive them in terms of a sequencing, but I really can't say what the government can or cannot do.
So my final question is, in July, the Standing Committee on Finance adopted an order for the production of documents related to the We Charity matter, and the committee directed the government to provide the documents in unredacted form to the Office of the Law Clerk and Parliamentary Counsel, that was you, for redaction, according to the parameters set out in that production order. However, in a letter to the Clerk of the Finance Committee, you indicated that the government had once again redacted the documents prior to them providing them to your office. And in testimony before the Standing Committee on Finance, Mr. Schugert said the following: "I'm afraid that it's a fact that if the executive branch were to give all of the documents of cabinet confidence or commercial sensitivity or solicitor-client privilege or national security to the law clerk, that it would be in a sense waiving that executive privilege, because the law clerk is a servant of the legislature, not of the executive." So my question is, if the government does this again with respect to the present directive, i.e. they redact for reasons not stipulated in the motion, or they do the redaction, again, what would your view be of whether that is conforming to the motion of the House and the privileges of this committee in the House?
Well, as I've done in the instance that you refer to with respect to the Finance Committee, we received documents, we looked at what they were, and we reported to the committee as to concerns that we had and the fact that we were not able to do what the House had asked us, what the committee had asked us to do in that instance. And that's exactly what we will be doing in this instance, is that once we receive the documents, we will review them to see what has been provided, and is this consistent with what the House has ordered. The House has ordered that certain things be excluded, namely minutes of cabinet committee and its cabinet and its committees, but that other redactions be made by my office. So we'll have to wait and see what we received, but we would advise the committee in terms of the implications of that. But I don't want to do that before I've received and seen what is in fact provided.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
Thank you, Mr. Davies. That brings us to the end of this section of our meeting. I would like to thank Mr. Dufresne and Mr. Bedard for your presence here today and sharing with your time and your expertise. And with that, we will suspend and bring in the next panel. Thank you. Meeting. So for this hour, we are engaged with we are continuing the study of the patented medicine price review board's guidelines. We have returning again, we have Dr. Mitchell Levine, chairperson, and Mr. Douglas Clark, executive director. I'm assuming, gentlemen, that you have you gave your statement last week. Do you have another statement this week?
I do not, Mitch.
No, and I don't either, although Mr. Clark has some comments to respond to some questions that were provided at the end of last session, and he does have a response to those questions.
Okay, I'll give you a few minutes to make that response. Thank you.
Okay. Well, we actually submitted them in writing in both official languages a few hours ago. I thought it'd be distributed to members by now, but is that not the case?
That's perfectly okay. In that case, we will start straight away with the questions.
Yeah, sure.
We will go to Mr. Kmiec. Mr. Kmiec, please go ahead. 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. So I want to go back to what we talked about on Monday about the $15 million threshold before these new PMPRB rules kick in. Can you just tell me, is that the list price or the rebate price? And how will you know when that $15 million threshold has been crossed?
It's actually not 15, it's 12. And it's based on real revenue. So that is reported to us by the patentee. They're required to report that revenue to us, so it will be pretty easy to monitor. About 50% or so of rare disease drugs, high-cost rare disease drugs that come to the Canadian market would be unlikely to hit that threshold and actually have sales above 12 million a year. Just to
so how was that $12 million threshold set?
Well, if memory serves, it was based on a methodology used by a sister organization in the US called HESA, where you basically look at how much we're spending on pharmaceuticals in a given year, how much GDP is increasing, like percentage GDP increase, multiply the percentage by the total spend on pharmaceuticals. That gives you some idea of what your budget envelope is to accommodate new drugs coming onto the market. And then you divide by the average number of drugs that are coming onto the market over a period of some years. Typically, it's around 35 new drugs per year. That gives you about $6 million envelope
Mr.
for any
Clark,
new drug.
And then we to interrupt you. Would you be able to provide that ICER report to the committee just afterwards at some time? I think that would be of interest.
Sure.
The reason I ask on this is because like 12 million is a pretty low bar. The list price of a drug like Zolgensma, which CADIF is trying to determine whether to approve or not, is just under $3 million. That's about 4 patients. So 4 kids with SMA1, and the manufacturer already breached at 12 million. But Zolgensma, just like Trikafta for CF patients, is just a game-changing medication. So they're going to have to go by these new rules in the PMPRB, which likely means that a $3 million drug that changes the life of a little boy or a little girl. I have 2 in mind, Kaysen and Harper in Edmonton. This is a condition that kills children by the age of 2. So this is why I'm wondering, this 12 million threshold, were patient viewpoints taken into account and the likelihood of patients dying while these PMPRB rules are implemented?
Well, like I said, about 50% or less of high-cost rare disease drugs that are coming onto the market would meet that threshold. But it's important to bear in mind, even when that threshold kicks in, for the time being, the new lower price ceiling, it won't be applied by us. As I mentioned at our Monday meeting, we're awaiting a decision, an appeal from the Federal Court of Appeal on that topic. So, for the time being, the only price ceiling applicable to Zolgensma, if assuming it comes to Canada, would be the median international price.
Median. So just moving on then, I was rereading all of the briefs, and I noticed, like the pharmaceutical companies are upset, obviously, with the PMPRB. You're affecting the revenue. I understand that. But when I read over all the patient advocacy and patient organizations, I find zero in support of these changes. Are there any organizations out there that represent patients that are absolutely 100% on board with all of these changes? These are organizations that represent patient families and patients across Canada. Do any of them support the PMPRB changes?
Yes. I mean, there are a number of independent patient organizations that don't accept any funding from outside sources from industry, and they submitted briefs to the committee. One is Breast Cancer Action Montreal or Quebec. The other one is Independent Patient Voices for Safe and Effective Drugs in Canada. Those are 2 that come to mind. But generally speaking, there's a correlation between whether a patient group is independent or accepts funding from the private sector as to where they sort of break in terms of support or opposition to the reforms. Mitch kind of alluded to that in his opening there. Dr. Levine stated as much in his opening statement when he said patient groups are kind of scattered across the divide that separates, on the one hand, payers who are struggling with these very high cost drugs, and on the other end, the industry who continue to want to charge these exorbitant prices.
So speaking of high prices, also a lot of the different health systems, health insurers across Canada also submitted briefs. I'm going to draw your attention to Alberta Health Services. That's my province. Alberta Health Services said that between the first proposal and the revisions in the second proposal, that none of their viewpoints were taken into account, and that no revisions were made of the ones that they were asking for. Is there a reason why the second version of the PMPRB's regulations, the ones to be implemented January 1st, completely ignored Alberta Health Services viewpoints and their submission on the changes that are needed to the PMPRB regulations?
Well, I'm not sure what submissions they're referring to off the top of my head. I can tell you that we did make substantive revisions, like major revisions, between the November and June draft, and those have been I think, instrumental in getting some of our stakeholders to sign on to the new guidelines. Ultimately, it's important to bear in mind. I've met many times with the folks who are responsible for the Alberta drug plan, and it's always been my understanding that they're very supportive of PCPA. I mean, these changes are a direct result of calls from the PCPA, which represents all the provinces, all the public drug plans, and the federal drug plan, for stronger federal measures to support them in their, in the difficulties that they're currently encountering and trying to negotiate a fair price with, a monopolist over a life-saving drug. So on the whole, I can't speak to this particular submission. I don't recall what they said exactly, but on the whole, public drug plans and private drug plans, I know CLIA submitted a brief as well, are uniformly supportive of these changes.
So it's interesting you bring up PCPA, because PCPA is the body that negotiates on behalf of.
I'm sorry, Mr. Kamek, you're over time.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
So we go now to Dr. Pawlowski. Please go ahead, Dr. Pawlowski, 6 minutes.
Okay, so I think this is really difficult stuff for someone to understand. So let me get this straight. The Patent Act sets out some criteria to consider for the PMPRB to consider in determining the price, or what price is considered excessive. And the Act allows the minister by regulations to add other criteria as to what makes a cost of a drug or the price of a drug excessive. So, and one of the new criteria is pharmacoeconomics. Is it the PMPRB or the CADTH, the Canadian Agency for Drug and Technologies in Health, that makes the calculation in terms of pharmacoeconomics?
Just to respond to the first part of your statement, that's absolutely correct. So criteria in the Patent Act enumerated there, and then additional criteria now having been added in by way of regulation by the Minister of Health. But in terms of the actual calculation, what we call the ICER value that will go into our formula, that will be conducted and calculated solely by CADTH, also on occasion INS, depending on whether there's a report available from INS and not CADTH. So yeah, we're not going to be, we've been saying this all along, we have no intention of duplicating that work. We are leveraging the existing expertise that we have within the sort of Canadian regulatory ecosystem and trying to complement it as best we can. So we're taking that input directly. We're not making any changes to those numbers. We're simply applying a formula. Does the ICER value meet or not meet our pharmacoeconomic value threshold in our guidelines, and then we go from there.
And now my understanding of pharmacoeconomics was largely this is a calculation of cost per quality adjusted life year. So that's what goes into calculating the ICER.
That's correct. Cost utility ratio is the official term.
Oh, okay. So now my understanding, and am I wrong in saying that this is HTA, right? Health technology assessment. And I've read, is this true that Canada's will be the first country which sets a maximum price, allowable price, based on a HTA?
Well, like I said on Monday, no two regimes are alike, and Canada, to my knowledge, is the only developed country with a price regulator that regulates pharmaceuticals. So the comparison kind of breaks down when you have that information. But there certainly are other developed countries where the reimbursement body won't enter into negotiations with the company unless the price is below a certain ICER threshold, and the UK and Japan are examples of that.
No. Now, in terms of what that threshold is, in terms of a maximum cost per quality, is there a limit? Is that $60,000? Is that what the limit is?
No. So the November 2019 draft that we initially consulted on had a $60,000 cost per quality maximum. But then, following the extensive consultations that we had with our stakeholders over the course of the ensuing 3 or 4 months, we opted to raise that threshold to $200,000 per quality. But the reality is we have a maximum, we have a cap on the extent of the price reduction. And so the cap, the degree of cap is a function of how good the drug is, the therapeutic benefit of the drug. The maximum cap on the price reduction would be 50%. For a breakthrough drug, it would be 20%. So as a result of the cap, even drugs, new high-cost drugs that don't meet that 200,000 cost per quality threshold, which is a very, very generous threshold, would still be able to pass our price ceilings, because the cap has the effect of increasing the cost per quality threshold. I know that's a lot of information that I'm throwing at you, but if you look in the guidelines, you'll see a threshold of $200,000 per quality.
So now, are there many drugs out there that are likely to come before you, which are going to exceed the cap?
Yes, probably. I mean, that's what the phenomenon that Dr. Levine was talking about on Monday. I mean, we're just getting more and more of those types of drugs that are extremely high cost. They can be north of $500,000 per quality, $1 million per quality. But that's the entire point of having health technology assessment, is to try to ensure that we're getting value for money. And those drugs typically don't get recommended by, well, they never get recommended for reimbursement by CADTH or an S unless they condition it on a major price reduction, sometimes in the order of 90, 95, 98%, which is the case with the cystic fibrosis drugs that have come to Canada in recent years.
Now, if some of the drugs we're talking about here are obviously life-saving drugs, and if we're setting a limit on how much we're willing to pay in terms of a cutoff in cost per quality, aren't we basically putting a price on life as to what price our government considers acceptable, how much we're willing to pay to save a life? And then I would ask, and maybe this is an unfair question, but from a democratic perspective, to by regulation put a value on life, that would seem to me somewhat undemocratic. This is done by regulation rather than this having gone through Parliament. Maybe that's an unfair question, but I think it's a bit of a philosophical question.
And maybe one that would be better directed to CADTH or an S, because that's precisely the type of work that they do. I mean, and HTA bodies across the world, is they figure out, okay, how much can we afford to pay for a quality adjusted life here? That's the nature of the exercise.
If I can add a comment at this
go ahead.
point. Yes. So I think one of the things you also have to remember is the more life-saving or effective a drug is, or dramatic the improvement is, the lower the cost per quality becomes.
That's right.
So when you're seeing drugs that are at $500,000 or $1 million per quality adjusted life year, the implication is either their price is just way off the chart, or in fact, it doesn't deliver on the outcome that one would really hope. So, really, really effective drugs, life-saving, life-altering drugs have lower cost per quality. That's the way that ratio works.
The other thing to consider is, in the absence of some kind of threshold or ceiling or ultimate, cap, what is the alternative? And the alternative is, I think a lot of people would say, well, you negotiate. And as Dr. Levine pointed out, in Canada, we don't have prescription medication isn't covered by our healthcare system. So at best, public payers are wielding 42% of the national buying power of the country. And, I think it's trite, but it's also important. It's true that it's very difficult to negotiate with a monopolist, especially when, you don't have a monopsony, right? So, and even more so where the monopoly is held over a life-saving drug. So you're basically, the alternative to saying, okay, well, we have to draw the line somewhere is basically saying, well, we'll take whatever the price that the company thinks is fair, that's what we'll pay. And that's not working out so well.
Thank you, Dr. Pulaski. We go now to Mr. Theriault. Allons-y, Monsieur Theriault.
Mr. Theriault for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. When you look at some of the documents we received, it seems there are divergent perspectives with divergent interest. What I'm trying to understand, what I think we should have with this study is to have some convergence points so that it's a win-win for everybody at the end of the exercise. So my perspective is that for people that have rare diseases, because they're the most vulnerable. So I'll play devil's advocate as I did in the last session, and I would do this with all those that testify before us during the study. You explained during the last meeting, and I quote, the average annual cost of patented drugs that are most sold has increased by about 1,000%, and the proportion of high-cost medication that costs over $10,000 a year has gone from 5% to about 40% for all pharmaceutical or drug expenses. But less than 1% of the population uses this medication, and of course, based on the document from the Canadian Rare Diseases Organization, the PMRPB is still using alarmist language to transmit the idea that Canada is paying too much for treatment of rare diseases, and they are confusing expenses in terms of categories for drugs to support its position. For example, fighting against rare diseases, the PM puts together oncological medications to produce a high number, and this justifies the need to proceed to reforms. In 2019, non-oncological medications to fight against rare diseases only represented 1.9% of the total bill for drugs in Canada. What would you answer to these statements? No, I don't have the data in front of me. It's kind of hard to answer. I can commit to doing an analysis of these figures and send them out, but I can't really assert if it's true or false. Off the cuff, I would have to work with my colleagues to do the right analysis. So you don't know that the total cost of orphan drugs is about $228 million. I can't affirm if it's true or false. I know that very high-cost drugs account for about 40% of the total expenses in pharmaceutical products in Canada. So why then the statement that they can prove this? Why this grouping if it's not just to inflate the statistics? I don't know if it's really to inflate costs. I think they're just trying to represent the reality. But what's the exact proportion that is linked to these rare diseases? I would have to do some research and come back to you. I don't really have the figures right here before me.
To offer a comment here, because I think we're mixing up a little bit of two things. One is we have high-cost drugs, and they're not just orphan drugs. Orphan drugs are often high-cost drugs, but that's not particularly the case. Much of what we were worried about in terms of high-cost drugs costing more than $10,000 per year, are in fact for common diseases now. Things like rheumatoid arthritis and rheumatological diseases, cancer, common problem. The therapies are very, very expensive. So I wouldn't say that this whole focus is about trying to manage the costs of rare disease as much as it's trying to manage the costs of very expensive therapies.
En tout cas, j'apprécierais.
I would appreciate, Mr. Clark, a written answer. During our last meeting, I asked you your opinion on several proposals. The idea of having a progressive implementation in applying the new guidelines of the PMRB, starting with coming up with new comparisons panels, and the pharmacoeconomic aspect should be put in place through more in-depth consultation, and that a multi-party committee be created to make the process more objective? You had answered that several measures that I had mentioned are already part of your plans for the future, so you don't have any issue with several of these proposals. So could you explain more specifically which of these measures could apply? Would they apply from the deadline of the 1st January? Well, if I understood you clearly, all the measures you described will be part of our plan once the new system would come into force in January 2021. We will go step by step. We will implement the new price ceilings that the results of new PIs, and maybe in 2-3 years, but it will depend on the decision of the Federal Court of Appeal. They will decide on the issue of whether we can obtain the information we need to verify if patent holders are accepting the new confidential price ceilings. But that's what we are doing. We will go step by step, and we are starting with the PEIs, and the new system will begin in January 2022. Right now, we are not applying the other confidential ceiling price. That's a maximum rebate price. In the meantime, we will consult with the patented groups and the other stakeholders over time on the issue of the multi-party surveillance committee. Mr. Therio, you've exhausted your time.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. In the PMPRB's most recent annual report, you noted the following, that the ratio of research and development expenditures to sales revenues for pharmaceutical patentees in Canada has been falling since the late 1990s and has been under the agreed upon target of 10% since 2003. In 2018, it was at 4% for all patentees and 4.3% for members of Innovative Medicines Canada. Is, in your view, Mr. Clark, will the PMPRB regulatory changes that are being proposed result in lower research and development investment in Canada?
Well, frankly, I mean, it can't get much lower, can it? I think one of the driving forces, the impetus behind these changes, is the realization that back in the day, when we chose the basket of comparator countries that we use, that we've used since the late 1980s, we did so on the basis of a policy presumption that if we priced in line with countries that have a significant R&D footprint, we'd come eventually to emulate that same footprint. In other words, those countries, you see an average 20-25% R&D to sales ratio in those other countries. So if we offer a level of intellectual property protection and price in line with those countries, we'll come to enjoy the same level of R&D. Well, that hasn't exactly panned out. So the government, I think, the underlying rationale for changing the list of countries is that they're choosing to pursue different policy objectives. They've realized that price, there's no organic connection between the price in a country and R&D intensity. Many of the countries that we compare ourselves to presently have lower prices than we do and considerably more R&D. So I think the emphasis going forward, the reason why we have those new 11 countries is the policy, the primary objective of policy is to ensure that we're getting prices that are more in line with the OECD median.
And just for the record, I mean, I think I speak for all of my colleagues. We would love to have more research and development in pharmaceuticals done in Canada. I think that's across all party lines. What I want to establish is you don't have any concern that these regulatory changes will negatively impact that. I got my answer. Similarly, do you think that the PMPRB regulatory changes proposed for January 1 will result in fewer clinical trials in Canada?
Oh, well, I mean, I guess that's the flip side or another facet of R&D. We don't see any evidence of that. I will say clinical trial intensity is going down. I think I mentioned this on Monday. in developing countries or developed countries across the board as industry kind of moves their R&D efforts into emerging markets. So we've seen a bit of a decline in Canada in clinical trials recently, but
and that's under the current regulatory regime.
That's under the current regulatory regime. Okay. Well, I guess you could say that that it's been declining for a couple of years now, and the regulations. I mean, they were adopted in August of 2019, so I'm not sure how that sort of coincides with that time period. But it's actually declining less dramatically in Canada than it is in many of these other countries, including the U.S., which has very, very high priced drugs.
Well, I think they're the number one country in the world, I think, for prices is the established
almost without exception. Yeah.
Similarly, my last question is, Vane, will the proposed PMPRB regulatory changes result in fewer drug launches in Canada?
Well, again, I think we tried to address this in the answers, the written answers to some of the questions that we undertook to follow up on Monday. And we certainly don't see that. I mean, actual applications, what we call new drug submissions to Health Canada for new active substances, in other words, new innovative medicines, is actually up in the past fiscal year. So since the regulations were finally adopted, and with these changes coming into force on the horizon, we're seeing an uptick in drugs coming to Canada, not a lowering. And then if you break it down quarterly, which we do in our answer, you don't see you see the same general trend. As the most recent quarter, it's actually above the average over the last 3 years. When you look at it quarterly, it's slightly above 9.8 versus 9.
I mean, I'm going to just say it bluntly if I can. I mean, it almost seems that the pharmaceutical industry, who controls where their R&D goes, they control where they launch drugs, they control where they have their clinical trials. It almost seems to me like they are threatening to reduce these things in Canada if the government proceeds with regulatory changes that are geared towards reducing prices that Canadians pay for increasingly expensive prescription drugs, and to get our prices more in line with what other countries are paying, and some changes to improve the pricing process. Would that be a fair comment?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course they are, and they're in doing so, they're just behaving rationally, and they do this in every country that tries to introduce reforms to try to contain pharmaceutical expenditures. It's just the nature of the game. I mean, I think, again, Dr. Levine made this point in his opening remarks. We are never going to get an industry sector to sign on to changes that will result in their revenues coming down. I keep using the analogy with people that for 5 years we've been asking somebody if they want a haircut, and they keep telling us no, and then we keep asking them, would you like your bangs cut shorter and a little shorter in the back? They don't want a haircut, right? So it doesn't. You can consult till the cows come home, but you're never going to get industry to back changes to regulatory regime that's going to result in less revenue for them. You're just
the bottom line,
you have to have a fair process and a transparent process, and that's what we think we've managed to do.
So the bottom line question too is, do you think these changes will help patients in Canada?
I do.
Thank you, Mr. Davies. That ends round one. We start round two now. 5 minutes for Mr. D'Entremont. D'Entremont, please, Mr. D'Entremont, please go ahead. 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I apologize for being a little late because I was doing a speech in the House. I know Ms. Sidhu was also over there as well, so it's just maybe a few different faces before us. I want to go sort of where you left off with Mr. Kamek. When you talked about patient groups who receive funding from pharmaceutical companies. And I mean, we received a lot of patient groups writing in about PNPRB changes. So I'm just wondering what threshold are we supposed to consider on support for patient groups? It's a difficult one here.
It is, and that I think that's your challenge. And I don't know if it's really my place to advise you in that regard. I mean, it's important to understand a little bit of history here, and maybe that helps you, at least contextualize it. So it used to be that the federal government contributed to charitable organizations like patient advocacy groups. But in the mid-90s, they decided to no longer fund organizations of that kind if they had a policy, a policy promotion, a policy lobbying arm, because the government didn't want to pay to have to engage with an organization that's ultimately giving it grief for a policy that it didn't like. And so that created a vacuum, and these organizations, in their defense, had to fill that gap somewhere. And so industry was only too happy to step in and provide that funding. And so in other countries, it varies across the developed world, but in some countries, they continue to fund their patient groups only on the condition that they prove that they're independent from industry. And in many of those countries, it's much easier to have a rational, evidence-based discussion about policy changes, in particular policy changes of this kind. I'm not saying every patient group that accepts money is biased, and I'm sure they certainly don't feel that way. But there's certainly a lot of research out there to show that when you take money from someone, it even implicitly, without your knowledge, subconsciously, it impacts your views. And there's definitely a correlation, and a pretty strong one, between where patient groups stand on these reforms and whether and the extent to which they accept funding from industry. Whether it's causative, I don't know, but there's definitely a correlation. It's hard to deny if you go through those briefs.
Yeah, because I go back to one of the meetings that we've all had with, I think, CF Canada, when CF Canada sort of said, or we want Trikafta to be covered, but if it becomes difficult to come, then we'll turn quickly on Vertex as well. So I don't think that their intention is to necessarily support the pharmaceutical companies, but in absence of direction, I suppose that you're the target of that.
Well, that's an interesting point you raise, because as I mentioned on Monday, a lot of other countries have struggled with the prices for these new, very promising, life-changing cystic fibrosis drugs. Mm-hmm. So there was a stalemate in many of these countries between the reimbursement body and the company, because they wouldn't bring their price down. And some of the patient groups in the UK and Switzerland, for example, decided that they were going to switch strategies and actually seek out a compulsory license and obtain a generic version of those drugs from a South American country. And it was only when that threat was made that you started to see, progress made at the negotiation table. So I think that's something for patient groups, not just with respect to this particular product line in this company, but patient groups to consider more generally. Is, it doesn't make sense to me that a company that saw its second quarter results go up 62% most recently and made $2 billion selling 4 cystic fibrosis drugs, is not in the hot seat to the same extent, as the government, because it refuses to bring a product to us unless we pay you among the highest prices in the world. It just doesn't seem sensible to me.
All right. Well, let me switch gears just a little bit, because it was in the news yesterday, so I'm sure you're aware of it, where I think Innovative Medicines was talking about vaccine production in Canada, and they sort of tied it back over to the PNPRB changes. So I'm just wondering if you had any thought on that, or had you seen that report?
Yeah, I have. I will say we've adopted a policy on a temporary basis to only look at these vaccines on a complaints basis. So if we get a complaint from a provincial or federal minister of health about the price, that's when we'll look at it. But the companies have already committed to providing these products at public, non-commercial, so-called humanitarian or compassionate prices for the duration of the pandemic. So I don't know why they would say that, unless they were saying, well, our intention was to price excessively in Canada, but now since the PNPRB is not going to look at us proactively, we'll bring the drugs here. I don't understand the statement.
Well, I think it has
Thank
to
you,
do.
Mr. Tantamon. Sorry. We go now to Mr. Kellaway. Mr. Kellaway, go ahead. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and hello, colleagues, and hello, witnesses. I just want to say how insightful I find this conversation. I know Canadians do as well, and also the great questions from all of my colleagues and the answers that follow. So I have 3 questions. We'll see if we can get through all of them. But the first one is around investments. So several other countries benefit from significant pharmaceutical industry investments while having considerably lower prices than Canada. Now, for example, Belgium receives 4 times more investment dollars than Canada, despite prices being 20% less. So can you identify, both witnesses, could you identify any lessons from the evolvement of drug regulation processes of our international partners, particularly those within the PMPRB 11, of which Canada could apply, rather, to our own drug regulation processes?
I'm not sure, whether there's anything we can do within the context of our drug regulatory processes that could change, the basic ratio that we're seeing today. I mean, the key distinguishing factor or feature between us and these other countries that you point to that have lower prices but more R&D is they have a homegrown industry there. Right. So, companies tend to focus their R&D efforts around their international headquarters, and we don't have a homegrown. We have a homegrown vaccine research facility that now has been purchased by Sanofi, and it's an incredible facility. And we have Glaxo for vaccines in Quebec, and Medicago, which is actually like a world-class pioneering vaccine facility. But I mean, in the late 60s, early 70s, the government introduced a number of policies that gave rise to a very robust and vibrant generic industry. And with Canadian companies that were true powerhouses internationally, but in the late 80s, I guess they decided to switch, their wagon, tie their wagon to a different horse, or bet on a different pony, or however you wish to describe it. So, but I will say, in fairness, there's one thing that we could do, and that is harmonize or align our processes so that it's much easier to go from a regulatory approval to actual reimbursement and sale. Right. I mean, in Canada, it's like a relay race because of overlapping and competing jurisdictional, roles. And that's really why I think a lot of people are advocating for a Canadian drug agency that would sort of collapse all these functions into one.
So greater clarity and flexibility. Is that what I'm hearing? In general?
Well, I think a one-stop shop. Yeah. I mean, that would be ideal. But like when you break down many of the sort of dysfunctional, intractable issues in Canada, a big part of the reason we can't overcome them is because we're a federation sometimes. That's my own personal opinion. But I do think there's a lot of goodwill out there, and you're certainly seeing different regulatory bodies in this space and different jurisdictions cooperating and collaborating in a way that we've never seen before, because they have to, because these, because of the cost situation that they're confronted with. So I think, it's an opportune time to capitalize on that goodwill and try to take that further and formalize that cooperation and collaboration.
Fantastic. So this is another question for both of you, or one of you. So price is considered to be a poor determinant of where new medicines are first launched. In many countries with lower drug prices than Canada, including the Netherlands, Sweden, the UK, and Norway, they have obtained early access to new medicines. And can you explain how? And I think this is an important question for all of us, but for Canadians watching, can you explain how the new guidelines will encourage further pharmaceutical innovation in Canada?
Well, I don't think we're making that assertion or that claim. I mean, we don't have a policy responsibility to encourage innovation. I mean, we're an economic regulatory body that ensures that prices of patented medicines aren't excessive. There's a lot of other things going on within government, both federally and provincially. In Quebec in particular, they have an organization, a public-private partnership called Catalyst, where they're doing amazing work to try to bring in more clinical trials in that province. But I don't think it's the purview of PMPRB to ensure that its guidelines, and its regulations and its regime in its totality encourages R&D. I mean, it would be nice if it did, but we don't have that mandate.
Okay. No, fair enough. Well, let me go to a third question if I have time. How much time do I have?
5 seconds.
Well, stay tuned for the next edition. I'll pass. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mr. Kellaway.
Answers.
We go now to back to Mr. Kmiec. Mr. Kmiec, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you again, Mr. Chair. So just to go back, I was looking this up online, but according to ICED's website, we have 2% of the world's pharmaceutical market, but we attract 4% of clinical trials. Clinical trials, though, are really an important way for patients to get access to drugs that are not eligible, they're not approved in Canada, they're not for public reimbursement. Has the PMPRB done any work or any internal analysis on over the next, say, year, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, what the expected drop is in clinical trials if these regulations go through, or are they expected to increase? Have you done that analysis and what the impact will be on patients and patient access to some rare disease drugs, rare oncology drugs in Canada?
Well, it's true. We are 2% of the world market, but that makes us, that's not a negligible amount. That makes us a top 10 market. It's not surprising that we would account for a significant amount of clinical trial development. But I will say that pharmaceutical patentees from the industry accounts for a small minority of those clinical trials in Canada. They are the exception. It's mostly other organizations within the healthcare system that conduct those clinical trials. So I can't say that you reduce a price to this or that amount will equal this or that number of clinical trials. I just don't think there's a formula that lands you there magically. All I can say is we are unable to discern a connection between or a strong correlation between price and clinical trial intensity. We don't see, in fact, we see the opposite.
So then I have a question then about the regulations that are to be introduced January 1st. Is there any mechanism within the PMPRB that's being planned or is already set up in place that is going to assess the impact of these new regulations, not on price, but on patient access to drug? And is it going to look at things like, how many Canadians are going to the United States or Mexico to get access to drugs? Is it going to look at, how many situations do people go on, GoFundMe pages in order to finance a drug that perhaps is approved in Canada but is not up for reimbursement? So what are the metrics that are going to be used but specific to patient access?
That's an excellent question, and we're working very hard on what we're calling a guidelines monitoring and evaluation plan. It's a very audacious, ambitious plan. We're going to be reaching out. It has 4 different sort of buckets of things that we'll be looking at and evaluating, and so many metrics falling into each of those buckets. But the things that you've just talked about do squarely fall into them. We're going to be reaching out very soon to our provincial and territorial colleagues, our counterparts, to help us formulate sort of an initial kind of framework. And then we're going to be going to patient groups and academics, and we're going to be engaging everybody to help us come up with a very, very exhaustive, comprehensive plan to make sure that
and when will it be complete?
By the end of fall 2021. So, but before any impact of these guidelines and regulations makes themselves felt, we'll have that plan in place. I can assure you of that.
So you're saying that the impact, the expectation from your agency is that the impact will not be felt between January 1st of 2021 and fall of 2021 before you have this evaluation plan in place?
Well, no price changes can take place as a result of of the new regime until January 2022. So.
Okay.
I think that's what I'm saying.
But will you do also an analysis? I mean, there's going to be a year lead time going into it. So some companies will obviously be making decisions, and also patients are going to be waiting for some of these drugs. They're seeing their friends and people that they know traveling to America. Like Trikafta is a perfect example because it happens all the time. And I just spoke with a patient who is on Trikafta through SAP in Canada, and it's a life-changing experience for her.
It is. Yeah.
So how are we going to track situations like hers where people who can't get access to SAP or, after it's approved, or if it is approved, they won't be eligible for it? How will you track that? Will they be part of those metrics showing that, these people didn't get access to it?
Yes, they absolutely will. There's 4,300 people in Canada that suffer from this awful disease. And Canada is renowned because of the CF Canada's very, very comprehensive and exhaustive database of all of those patients. So that's a great tool for us to rely on and being able to track those things. So absolutely, we will.
Chair, how
thank
much
you,
time do
Mr.
I have left?
4 seconds. 2 now.
4 seconds. Darn.
Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Kmiec. We'll go now to Mr. Kellaway. Sorry, Mr. Van Bynen. 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us again today to share their expertise on PBR. We're living in a world where information is easily accessible to everyone and at a time, in any form and anywhere. And as a consequence, there's also that disinformation is easily accessible. It's often said that disinformation will be halfway around the world before the truth has put its shoes on. But many, if not most of us, are not familiar with PMPBR, and I'd like to take today as an opportunity to ask what is fact and what is not, and to elaborate where possible. So with this in mind, could you tell the committee whether the following statement, lower drug prices will lead to a loss of research and development and manufacturing, is that a myth or is that a fact?
There is no empirical evidence to back up that statement, and to the extent that there is empirical evidence, it would suggest a contrary conclusion.
Thank you. And so what are your thoughts on the following statement? Canada's approach is out of step with that of the rest of the world. Is this a myth or a fact, and how does our approach compare to the rest of the world?
It's both a fact and a myth. Like I said, no two regimes are alike, and Canada is the only country with a universal healthcare system that doesn't include prescription drug coverage, and therefore, the idea was we're going to try to approximate what we would be able to secure by way of our monopsony power if we were buying on behalf of the total population by creating a ceiling price regulator. So there is no other country that has a ceiling price regulator in this sector like Canada does, but the new economic factors that we're adopting as part of these regulatory changes are based on pharmacoeconomic value, market size / affordability, are based on best practices internationally. And I'm not aware of any country where these things are not given prominence in the process for determining whether to reimburse a drug and at what price.
Okay, thank you. During these challenging times, something that is on everybody's mind is their job. And is the statement that some drug manufacturers may be forced to cut jobs in Canada, is that a myth or a fact? And could you elaborate on that, please?
I can't speak for it. I think that question should be directed at the companies. I know there's been a lot of attrition in pharmaceutical industry footprint in Canada in the last 10 or 15 years ago. I believe the Prime Minister spoke to that in question period a few days ago. Whether this will exacerbate that, I mean, it's not for me to say.
Okay, it sounds to me like the major differentiator is the fact that we're lacking significantly in homegrown manufacturing.
I think that's my personal sort of take on the situation, and well, I shouldn't say that. It's one of them personal. I mean, the data supports that conclusion that companies tend to focus their R&D efforts, resources, investment around in proximity to their international headquarters.
Okay, thank you. Many of our international partners have updated the rules to constrain rising drug prices from many years ago. The new PMPBR guidelines appear to be quite similar or drawn directly from those that are already in place in other countries, including those with large pharmaceutical industries such as the United Kingdom, France, Japan, and Australia. Considering this, would you identify some of the challenges that PMPBR has faced in fulfilling its mandate of protecting Canadians from excessive pharmaceutical prices over the years, and how will these new guidelines help address some of these challenges?
Wow. I mean, I think we've got a number of sort of motherhood seminal policy documents out there that I think I would refer you to. I mean, that's a big question with a long answer. I think, the document that I would refer you to first and foremost is our 2015-18 strategic plan, where it really sets out exactly what you're talking about in writing and in a way that I hope is accessible to most people. But I think, this, just going back again to Dr. Levine's opening remarks, it's just that it's the dramatic shift that we've seen in the nature of the products that are dominating the market. So from small molecule drugs that treat common ailments and that are arguably within the means of ordinary people to complex biologic drugs that treat more rare diseases that are clearly not within the means of anybody, and even institutional payers struggle with. That's one big change. It's necessitated a corresponding change to our regime. And the other big change is Canada sort of pioneered this practice of international reference pricing as a way to ensure that we're getting a reasonable and fair price. But since doing that in the late 80s through the creation of PMPRB, most other countries have copied that. And one of the ways that industry has responded to try to make that a less effective policy is by negotiating confidential rebates and discounts off the public list price. So that's driven pricing underground, and that's proved to be another big challenge for us. And so the changes that have been made to the regulations and the guidelines go directly to the heart of those changes. I mean, the new regulatory tools, the economic tools, pharmacoeconomic value and market size will enable us to ensure that Canadians are getting value for their money for these products that have, nosebleed price tags. And one of the other changes that is currently before the Federal Court of Appeal requires patentees to provide us with the information on those confidential discounts and rebates so that we can regulate the true price in the market. And so that's a long-winded answer, but if you want more information, I'd really encourage you to go to our website, because we've been very transparent over the last 5 years about what the problem is, what our proposed solution is, and the path for getting there.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Van Bynen.
Thank you.
Monsieur Thériault, c'est à vous maintenant. 2 minutes et demie, s'il vous plaît.
Monsieur Thériault. Mr. Thériault, go ahead.
Est-ce que c'est à moi, Monsieur le Président, ou j'ai pas entendu là. Il y a un problème.
There is a sound problem. It seems because there was no sound.
Un comité multipartite d'évaluation de surveillance là, pour créer et apporter un peu d'objectivité dans le processus.
To bring in more objectivity into the program. Do you agree with that, or yes or no? It's certainly a committee. I don't know if I would call it a committee. I don't know if I would call it a committee. If I would call it a surveillance committee or control board. I don't know if it's in accordance with our laws, but there's a lot of commitment to assist us to do our work in the new regime. How much time do I have left, Mr. Chair? Well, maybe your answer would be too long. Others have some questions about the new guidelines on the life sciences ecosystem in Quebec. We've adopted a Quebec strategy for life sciences, which is promotes economic development. We have the same concern with the life science group in British Columbia. So the reform you're proposing, people have a hard time seeing a concrete analysis of the direct impacts that it would have on the life sciences ecosystem, not only on industry, but research institutes, teaching hospitals, research, clinical trial centers. Could you ensure us that you have taken into account this global impact for new guidelines? In 5 years, I think you've had time to produce this analysis. And if you have produced them, how did you include those in your reflection and your reforms? Well, I think today's testimony from me is quite clear. We agree that research data doesn't support that idea. It's as if some stakeholders saying, or they make a statement without any basis, and they ask us to prove the contrary. So for us, there is no link between the cost and the research and development activity in Canada. So I'm not really sure how to answer such an assertion. So in 5 years, you haven't done any analysis on the economic impacts or the local impacts on life sciences, if I understand you. On life sciences, no. On the prices, no.
La position, c'est qu'il y aurait aucun impact parce qu'il y a.
We go now to Mr. Davies. Mr. Davies, 2 minutes and a half.
Thanks, Mr. Clark. I have 2.5 minutes, so I'm going to ask you 3 questions and ask you to try to answer them succinctly so I can get them all in. First of all, generally, what percentage of research dollars that go into patented medicines is publicly funded?
Well, that depends on the country. Are you talking about Canada?
Canada. In Canada.
I don't have that number at my fingertips, but it's a considerable amount. And there's an economist, Maria Mazzucato, who does a lot of work in this area. But I can certainly get back to you with that. For example,
could you please?
Trikafta in the U.S. was developed on the basis of quite a bit of funding from the National Institute of Health and from the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation in the U.S. Right, so it's not uncommon. In fact, it's more common than uncommon.
Thank you. I was going to move to Trikafta because obviously special access is not working for the many Canadians who have living with cystic fibrosis. So I'm just wondering, how best should we proceed to ensure that CF patients can get access to this life-saving, life-altering medicine? What would you recommend?
I think I would go back to, if I had if I was omniscient and omnipotent, I would do as the government, has committed to do a few years back and pursue the establishment of a national drug agency. I think, that is the single most, I would say, well-substantiated complaint about the Canadian, about penetrating the Canadian market is it's like a relay race where you have to go through one hurdle after another. You think you're there, and then, oh no, suddenly, you have to submit information to PMPRB, you have to submit information to CADTH, and finally you get to the public reimbursement point. So I think more buying power and a Canadian drug agency.
Can I also you did briefly mention compulsory licensing. As I understand it, that's the power of the state. When a patent holder refuses to act on a patent and they have access to, a life-saving molecule or something of great public interest, it allows the state to act on that patent if the private patent holder won't. Is that something that maybe we could look at? If Vertec will not apply in Canada to make Trikafta available to the patients who need it, is compulsory licensing an option?
That's a really good question. I mean, as I said, that's what patient groups were threatening to do in the UK and Switzerland, and that's kind of what brought Vertex back to the table, is my understanding. There are a number of provisions in our Patent Act that allow for compulsory licensing. One is Section 6566, refers to the kind of situation that you just described, where the patentee refuses to provide the patented product on reasonable terms. But it's actually, there's a much more open-ended provision, 19, in the Act that allows the government to override a patent for public non-commercial use or in emergent circumstances. All of these provisions, as you probably know, Mr. Davies, Canada used to have a compulsory licensing system in effect that allowed generics to produce patented drugs at any point in the lifetime of the patent. But in the early 90s, mid-90s, we entered into an NAFTA, we entered into the WTO TRIPS agreement, and those agreements have a lot of sort of standards and restrictions on the degree to which countries can avail themselves of those provisions. And so our provisions reflect the language, kind of track the language in NAFTA and TRIPS. But it's not like it's an impossibility. And a lot of countries, I can tell you, when I go abroad and meet with my counterparts, a lot of countries are saying, we lack the tools to deal adequately with the types of prices that we're seeing. We need to explore more this option of compulsory licensing and see whether we need to make changes to our legal regimes and whether we need to amend the sort of multilateral agreements that we've entered into, or like, have we gotten to a point where we're in the same position that developing countries were 20 years ago with drugs for tuberculosis, AIDS, and malaria, where they just can't afford what the price is in the market. I think increasingly developed countries find themselves in that same situation. And so now there's an openness, to talking about compulsory licensing more broadly.
Thank you, Mr. Davies.
Thank you.
So that brings us to an end of our questioning for today. Thank you, Mr. Clark, Dr. Levine, for giving us your time and your expertise today. And thanks everyone on the committee. Excellent questions. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.